Let's take a look at the respiratory system, the system that we are often conscious of, even though we don't necessarily think about it all the time. But if you ever get in a situation where you can't breathe well, you really notice it. If you're an athlete, you usually notice it, especially when you exert yourself and you run a little bit low on oxygen or air. You really notice it in your body. So anyway, let's first of all look at some of the anatomy of the respiratory system, and then later we'll talk about the physiology and the mechanics of breathing. First of all, we kind of break the respiratory system down into what we call the upper respiratory system, which is everything above the glottis, which is that opening into your larynx and trachea region. And then everything below that opening, after air goes through there, including the trachea, most of the larynx, the trachea, and the lungs, and all the parts of the lungs, that's going to be considered the lower respiratory system. Okay, now here we actually see part of the upper respiratory system, the nasal cavity, and of course here we see the mouth. So we have two openings which are going to allow air into the respiratory system and also allow us to get the waste products of air back out. Here we see a larger view of the upper respiratory system, everything above this, and we see that we had some bones in the skull that we called nasal conchae, and we actually had an inferior nasal conchae, which was an individual bone. Then we had the ethmoid bone, which contained the superior and middle nasal conchae. Of course, in this picture, what we see is the nasal conchae lined by the mucous membrane. Remember, we have a mucous membrane that lines every entrance and exit to the body. So we have what we would typically call our nostrils or external nares, and we have the area just inside the nasal vestibule. And of course, what happens is when we breathe, air comes in through the external nares into the nasal vestibule, and it kind of swirls in between these little pathways called turbinates in between my nasal conchae. And what that ends up doing is by the time the air enters and gets to the pharynx region, the throat region, particularly this upper area called the nasopharynx region, then the swirling and the movement through these areas has given it a chance to do two things, and that is to warm up and to moisten the air, because the air that goes down to the lungs, warm, moist air is much healthier and easier on the lungs than cold, dry air. Okay, so we have three regions of the pharynx that we can see here, pharynx being an anatomical name for basically throat area. We have the nasopharynx, which is up here behind the nose in this upper area. We have the oropharynx, which is the area of the throat behind the mouth. Here you can see the tongue, big muscular portion. And then we have the laryngopharynx, which is down here basically where the epiglottis would cover the glottis when we swallow as the tongue pushes that back. But also this would be the area that would be kind of a common area for both air and food. And of course, when we got food or fluids, we would want to swallow that down the esophagus and not get it down the through the glottis down into the trachea and to the lungs. So the epiglottis would cover that. But what we would want to do is when we breathe in air, we don't necessarily want air going down in our stomach. We want air going down through the glottis, the opening here, and then trachea down to the lungs. And then we want to be able to exhale air out the same passageways. Okay, so looking at the larynx, which is a little different from the pharynx is actually the throat area, this muscular tube area from the nose, mouth, and in front of the larynx, but the larynx itself is what, some people might call their voice box, or Adam's apple, maybe even. That's kind of a misnomer. But this cartilaginous thing that you can actually feel from the outside, now don't push on it too hard because you don't want to hurt yourself, but this is an area that has basically cartilage and ligaments attached to it that forms a passageway, ties into an area that is like a tube with incomplete rings around it, called the trachea. So what we want to do next is actually look at this area here called the larynx and make sure we understand the difference between the pharynx and the larynx. Here we see the larynx, and notice this huge piece of cartilage here, and it's called thyroid cartilage, and thyroid literally means shield. Now most of us have heard of the thyroid gland, which actually sits below it down here, but the gland was named more after the cartilage, and the cartilage was actually named after a shield. So notice that it's kind of full in the front, but if we turn it around in the back, there's kind of an opening in the back, so this cartilage doesn't go all the way around, but instead has an open area back here. And of course, we would need that open area back here so we have room for air to come in and air to go back out. Okay, here's the epiglottis, that flap of elastic cartilage tissue that is a reflex that comes down and covers the glottis, and here we see the glottis. There it is closed. Here's an actual picture of the glottis. That's the space, again, if we look back here, that is the space that air is actually going down through. Okay, so you can see the glottis open, and here's the epiglottis, that flap of cartilaginous elastic cartilage tissue, and there it is in an actual picture that's very flexible and that would cover that every time we swallow. All right, now below the thyroid cartilage, we have this smaller piece of cartilage that does go all the way around called the cricoid cartilage. And then below the cricoid cartilage, we actually have the trachea with the ligaments and the actual hyaline cartilage rings, the tracheal cartilage rings. But notice they don't completely connect in the back. And this is advantageous from a couple different standpoints. One is that it's a little lighter if we don't have cartilage all the way around. It's still strong, it still holds the trachea open, but we got to keep in mind that we also have the esophagus running back here. So it seems like possibly that if the esophagus is run down here and that cartilage was all the way around, it could interfere a little bit with food going down the esophagus. Okay, now, so again, if you ever hear of having to intubate somebody, that's where they have to insert a tube to keep the glottis open. So they would insert the tube here, make sure the airway stays clear. Notice on either side of the cartilage, of the glottis, we actually have some what we call vocal folds. This area here, and in here we see the vocal folds that would close up. These are actually what you typically hear called vocal cords. So this is actually what we vibrate with air to make our voice sounds. Okay, now the trachea then, of course, extends down into the thoracic region and then branches out in an area called a bronchus. So one bronchus goes this way, one bronchus goes this way. It's called the primary bronchus, and then it branches into smaller and smaller, almost like an upside down tree, where we're going into smaller branches and eventually to some areas called bronchioles. Okay, let's look at this. Let's look back at this branching section, and notice that I've got cartilage and ligaments here, and in the larger, what's called the primary bronchus, which there would be a primary bronchus, and then primary bronchus would branch off. Then it would branch into the next branches would be called secondary bronchus. Notice that in the primary bronchus, my cartilage actually goes all the way around this, and it's pretty large. By the time I get to secondary bronchus, notice that the cartilage here and here is not totally circling it, but I still have it on there. Notice when I get to my next level, so each of the primary branches further into what we call tertiary bronchi, and then the tertiary bronchi branch into what we call smaller bronchi. But notice my cartilage that's there supporting this gets smaller and smaller and smaller, but when I get to this area called bronchioles, there's no more cartilage, but instead what I have is I have smooth muscle, and anytime I have smooth muscle, that means I have the ability to change the size of this. So if I constrict smooth muscle, I'll make my passageways smaller. If I relax the smooth muscle, I'll make the passageways bigger at this point. Now I really can't change the size of this up through here, but I can change the size of the bronchioles. Then I get to an area called a terminal bronchiole, the last bronchiole before I get into this region here, these little sacs that are called alveoli. And when I very first start seeing the alveoli, some of the individual alveoli, like in this region and this region, then I'm in the area called the respiratory bronchiole. Before I have any of the sacs, the last bronchioles I get to are called terminal bronchioles. But as soon as I see my first alveoli, an individual alveoli, then I'm in an area called the respiratory bronchiole. Then I actually have sacs of alveoli in here, and it's like almost like clusters of and what these alveoli do, they actually increase the surface area, because in the little sacs they are embedded with capillaries, and of course that's where we're going to exchange the gases, carbon dioxide out of the blood and oxygen into the blood. And when I say into the blood, to the blood of the capillaries that are surrounding these little air sacs. Now look at this. So here's our air sacs. Here's my capillaries surrounding it. Here are the capillaries actually in the walls of the air sacs. And why is that important? Because the more capillaries I have in the walls, the more air I can exchange back and forth. Oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. Oxygen, I want oxygen to come in. Now, it's coming in with other gases, but it's still the most important gas coming in. Carbon dioxide going out. We produce carbon dioxide through cellular respiration, and it becomes a waste product I need to get out. So the only way I can exchange it in and out is to have a bunch of capillaries, because oxygen wants to go to the blood, so I can take it back to the heart and pump that oxygenated blood to the rest of my cells. And then I want to get the carbon dioxide out of my systemic venous blood, into, which then will be exhaled out. Now, there's a very thin membrane between the alveoli. There's a simple squamous. Remember, simple squamous are the thinnest cells we have, and that usually provides good exchange surface, something thin enough where I can exchange gases across it. So I've got a simple squamous epithelial cell membrane off my alveolar cell. I have a simple squamous cell off my capillary right here. They're only 0.5 micrometers across, extremely thin, so that's thin enough for oxygen and carbon dioxide to be able to exchange back and forth. Okay, now, of course, I have millions of this alveoli making up my actual lungs. So looking at the lung overall, notice that I have an apex or a pointed area up here at the top. I have a base or a flatter area down here in the bottom. But my lungs are not exactly symmetrical. The body's fairly symmetrical, but there are some places where it's not, and here's one place where it's not. So we actually have 3 lobes or sections of the lung on the right lung, but only 2 sections of the lung on the left lung. And we actually have a little area here that the heart kind of sits against called the cardiac notch on the left side. So what separates these lobes are little separations called fissures. So notice that I actually have what's called an oblique fissure, one fissure that separates 2 lobes on my left lung, but I've got 2 different fissures. I've got an oblique fissure and a horizontal fissure, and these 2 fissures actually end up separating 3 different lobes. So my right lung has more lobes and more fissures. My left lung has less lobes and less fissures. Okay, so now the next video will be more about what are the dynamics of how breathing takes place. So if you're familiar with the pictures, the parts, then the next thing we would want to do, of course, is talk about how does air actually go in and go back out. So we'll be talking about that next.